The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? We're trying. My camera's really bad, so we're trying me using Corin's computer, and he's kind of holding down the fort on my computer. Just let me know if it gets weird. So good morning. For those I haven't met, my name is Sarah. My Dharma name is Dōjin, and I'm one of the head priests at Stone Creek Zen Center, and I use the pronouns she and her. And I'm happy to be here this morning. It's been a while, actually. I don't think I even gave a talk in November, which is unusual. But I'm happy to see you all this morning and be with you. Just to begin with, I just want to invite us all to, if you like, if it works for you this morning, to just take a couple breaths that you can feel, that you can actually, that you're consciously aware of. See if you can feel the body responding to the inhalation and exhalation. And also the invitation to just arrive in our physical bodies. See if you can feel it. It may help to close your eyes. Just feeling contact with the chair or the cushion or the floor, however, whatever posture you're in. And include having a human body in what you're aware of. Which, you know, we might think we do, but sometimes we don't. and I find it especially challenging on Zoom. We're having a very sweet, we have a socially distanced outdoor store on our porch as a way to support Stone Creek, and it's been just really lovely to see, as people are just showing up on our front porch, and I'm like, oh, people have legs. We're more than just torsos, I'm so happy to see a full range of our human experience. And really noticing how much I miss being together in person and just interacting with a wide range of people, just generally and specifically in Sangha. This morning, I want to talk about discipline. This concept has come into my mind a lot lately, and both as it works in Zen practice and also as it's a support for us in our lives and in our effort for liberation and freedom. I think partly there are two things that really got my mind turning around the concept of discipline, maybe three actually. One is COVID and the working with the restrictions and how I feel supported by my life and practice and training to keep encountering the limitations that are being put on us and the constrictions of responding to this collectively. Another is thinking about the Buddha's awakening, which we in Zen celebrated on December 8th last week. And we had a half-day sitting, and it was really lovely for those of you who were able to come to some or all of that, to share that with you. And the third was a quote I heard that's, it's attributed to a woman who's an activist and abolitionist and organizer, Miriam Kaba. And the quote is, "Hope is a discipline." And because I was so curious about where that came from, I ended up seeking it out and finding an interview with her. And actually, she heard that quote from a nun. I'm assuming it was a Christian nun, who spoke those words as an encouragement for people who care about the well-being of others and the world to stay in the world. And maybe I'll come back around to that. But just to let you know, those were the pieces coming together for me and thinking about this word discipline. And And I think for me, it's a very expansive word. It's not a discipline or a concept. Discipline is not a harsh and like strict thing. And maybe that's a large part because of how I've encountered it in Zen. Discipline is it's an ongoing effort, and it's an encouragement to being in relationship to one another. So in Zen practice, I've been thinking about how even in a lay Sangha like ours at Stone Creek, or the practice at Stone Creek, and in the United States, both for convert Buddhists and for people who are coming into Buddhism through family heritage, most people probably practicing Zen are lay people. And still there's roots of both like the forms and the practices, and also the understanding of the teachings that in my view are rooted in monastic training. So whether that's our experience or not, the view that Zen in the United States has on Buddhist concepts actually even comes through something that we can experience through monastic training. So whether that's ever been your experience or not, it's good to know that those threads come through in how Zen gets taught, and this philosophy and practice gets taught. So I wanted to say a little bit about my life and experience when I did live in a monastic setting, and look at some of the pieces there, like what happens in a monastic setting. Because I think actually from the beginning of the pandemic, I've seen there's just been, to me, there's a lot of parallels with living in a monastery. There's these limits on what you can do and where you can go. There's this kind of confinement. And in practice, that's helpful. I think in a dominant culture in the United States, it's seen as problematic and difficult and frustrating and limiting and just negative mostly. So I want to pull some of those threads forward so we could maybe have some encouragement in this time of a lot of restriction and limitation. So when you live in a monastery, so the training that most of the monastic training I did was at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, which is part of San Francisco Zen Center. And that we do 3 months, so 90-day practice periods where you don't leave the monastery. And everyone has an assigned job and a role within the structure. And I was I was reflecting on how many things are not up to you. There's no choice about it. Like, you don't choose what you wear. Everyone wears robes. There's a variety of robes. But, still, there's a lot of limitation around what you wear. You don't choose what you eat. You don't choose what you do or when you do it or who you do it with a lot of the time. There's not a lot of self going on. And of course there is self, right? Like, and one of the things that becomes super vivid are these little ways that the self will try to express itself and come up, and people's choice of long underwear becomes like a really essential expression of self. Or like, I used to paint my toenails just to be me, and what you choose to eat on your day off, there is some choice there. And one of the things you work with when you live in a monastic setting is the tension between handing oneself over and almost like a surrender into being part of this larger body, and also those particularities of the self that want to come up and do come up over and over again. And so it's a very intensive way to study the self, actually. But what it ultimately is, I think there's a way people would feel like, oh, you just put these limits, and in that kind of, and under that pressure, you see yourself differently. I think actually the value, we can flip it around instead of seeing like, oh, the self gets squished. Actually, the value of a monastic setting is we value the relational being of all of us. We value the relational body that we are. That becomes more primary than an individual self-expression. And when that becomes more primary, you're actually living in that setting in what I would say is a microcosm of reality. which is that each person is particular and has a particular role, but that you have to serve that function for the body of the whole Sangha to function, to work. And what's neat about that is, so it's a teaching about intimacy and the reality of connection. And what works, I would say, in a monastic setting, or at least as I experienced it, was it's a small enough scale that you actually can take it in. So it's a teaching about the reality of relationship and connectedness of the self and all beings. And you can actually, it's the impact is immediate. If you don't show up in the Zendo when you're supposed to be in the Zendo, for example, there's ramifications, like it ripples through the community. If you start a relationship, a romantic or sexual relationship with somebody, that impacts the whole community. If you make a choice to leave, and sometimes people would freak out and just leave, everybody feels it. So there's this, you're in a setting where the truth, which is true in all settings and all realities, of how an individual is related to all beings and all things, it's actually functioning in a way you can see. And to me, that was the teaching. And what can happen over time is that these things that, and you do have to get used to it, actually. Like you have to get used to the limitations. And especially, I would say, for someone like me who comes from dominant white culture in the United States, where individuality is prized and elevated, it's uncomfortable process of getting used to the limitations on the self. And eventually, if you stay long enough, there is freedom in it. Like it becomes, that's the ground of the freedom, that the self can soften a little and relax, and you can actually feel yourself in relationship to all the beings around you and all things around you. And so what I mean by being relational is not just between people, but between everything. And many of the ceremonies we enact in a monastic setting are actually literally celebrating and enacting relationship and this relationality. And this view of ourselves, holding a view of ourselves as particular beings, but also totally entwined with all things, in my experience, is an expression of skillful view or right view, the first portion of the Eightfold Noble Path. And this is really what the Buddha woke up to in the awakening that we celebrate in Zen on December 8th. The Buddha, so there's a whole, and if there's time, there may not be, but in the story of the Buddha's awakening, as I understand it, a bunch of things happen. And then finally the Buddha sits down with a great resolve and sits through the night. And what's the revelation that the Buddha has? And again, anyway, as a relational being is how all things are related. He wakes up to cause and effect and the workings of karma. And then because he can understand the workings of karma, the teaching that's distilled from that is the four noble truths. That truth that there is suffering, that there's a cause of suffering, which is craving, and usually the craving for things to be otherwise than they actually are. Often that's the craving for us to imagine ourselves separate from things when the reality is that we're connected. And there's a way to end the suffering, and there's a path to end that suffering, and that's the Eightfold Noble Path. And the first and foundational piece of that path is right or skillful view. When in the 4-month course that Corinne and I and Reverend Lian and Dalila Bothwell taught together last fall, and that we'll teach again beginning at the end of January, which is the Dharma of being anti-racist. We use the Eightfold Noble Path, and which is again rooted in this first one, skillful view. And Reverend Land brought up the image of Indra's net as a way to imagine skillful view. Like, what do we mean by a skillful view? What is a skillful view? And if we utilize this metaphor of Indra's net, And I don't know if people are familiar with this, but the picture, the image of it is like a spider web, kind of like a web of a network. And each place of intersection is a jewel. And each jewel, the teaching of Indra's net is that each jewel reflects the whole of the net. And this is a teaching about reality, actually. And we are the jewels, you know. We each and everything that's particular, anything we could pick out in all of our experience, you know, people, but also like thoughts and stuff and animals and houses. Everything that we can name as a particular thing is a jewel. And if we spend a lot of time studying those jewels, looking closely at the jewels, and in relation to the net, like, and factoring the net in and the web in, we start to see upon inspection that the jewels are actually just accumulation of net or of webbing, and that they're made up of all the things that connect everything. And in another way of putting that is like that the web is conditions or karma, and jewels are momentary accumulations, and they do look particular, and they are particular. You know, we are particular. Each one of us is particular. And also, we're not a part, though. And in fact, we're made up of what we think of as the web, of all these conditions that create us. Anything we can see is just an accumulation of conditions. And this is an image of a skillful view. When we can hold that, like, yes, we see particular things, and also those are made up of all these other things, we are abiding in skillful view. And our possibility to respond skillfully to the situation is greatly increased because we're dealing with reality versus coming from a place of delusion of separation. And it's really, you know, more and more, both like philosophically and spiritually, but also scientifically, we're finding like that's what we are. Human beings are not separate things. We are systems. We are in our own bodies whole ecosystems. We are in relation to one another whole ecosystems. You know, we depend on the atmosphere and this layer of sustaining gases that we live in and swim through. This idea was, I was listening to an interview so someone told me about an interview they found encouraging. And so I listened to this interview, and it was from the podcast On Being with Krista Tippett. And it was an interview with a man named Agustin Fuentes, and he's an evolutionary anthropologist. And I'll try to, at some point, I'll put in the chat, I can put the link to this if you're curious. And he was actually quoting someone else as saying, a fish is born expecting water as a human being is born expecting culture, that we're wired for connection and social interaction. And I would say a human being is born expecting relationship and relationality, expecting connection. And that we actually depend on it. You know, he was, our endocrine systems, our nervous systems, our gut functioning, all these things that we think of as sort of personal and internal depend on our social interactions. And right now, and I think it's important to know that, because then it makes sense of how we are all quite depleted now with the limitations on our social interactions and the strangeness of all the limits around our social connections with COVID. My dad actually also pointed me to an article that I'm sure some of you have seen that was in the New York Times last Sunday, The Social Life of Forests. And it also, and again, made me think of, you know, it's like what we're, quote, discovering, which, you know, many traditions have known for many centuries, that all things are connected. So one of the illustrations in that article was about the communication between trees in forests and across species. So it's not just between trees of their own kind, which we would think, if we've been indoctrinated in Darwinian theory or the reductive Darwinian theory that people put out there, actually. And one example was these quote forestry people in the 20th century were doing things like they actually didn't want a thriving, they weren't actually interested in a relationship of the forest. They were interested in producing lots of lumber, so an extractive idea. And so they wanted a bunch of Doug fir because that was good for lumber. And so they made these, they cleared these lands and just put in, are people able to hear? I just got to chat that Tomas can. They just put in little Douglas fir saplings by themselves, no quote competitors in the environment. And these Douglas firs do not thrive, and they're super prone to disease, and they usually die. And it's like, in some ways, it's like, duh, a Douglas fir is not a separate thing. It's a particular arising within a system of co-relational vitality. And it depends on other species and, fungi and all this other stuff. And if you take it out of that, and it made me, actually, the first thing it made me think of hearing those lonely Doug firs that were like not thriving was us. It was like human beings, chopped up into little suburban lots and isolated and disconnected from one another. And in my experience of, in the culture I was raised in, which really has that concept of like good fences make good neighbors. This is Robert Frost's idea. He was from New England too. That we just have our little pads of property, and then like whatever we do on there, it's just about us, and it doesn't matter, and nobody else should be impacted by it. We are not thriving in that isolation, and we are not thriving on a soul level in disconnected from one another in that way. And it really belies, like we have to do a lot of self-deluding over and over again to think that something like good fences make good neighbors, Like boundaries are good, healthy boundaries are good. But we all know what makes good neighbor. Like think of the neighbors that you've had in your life who are good neighbors. It's relationship. Relationship makes good neighbors. Connection and love, even, and caring, and shared experiences and purposes. So, in this sense, I think to come from a place of skillful view, like to really abide in the noble eightfold path, is diametrically opposed to individualism. It really is. Like it's very counter. For me, it's countercultural to what I've been trained in. I was trained that the individual is the primary thing, and that you can distill it out, and that whatever it does, it should be able to do in a vacuum. And if we look at that carefully, we have to delude ourselves over and over again to keep that delusion going. Because it's not our experience, because our experience as living human beings, and saying our and we here, I mean, as human beings, is that we depend on one another for our well-being on every level, from our food to our soul. And so it's a kind of very particular discipline, I would say, if we were raised, and in particular, to whatever extent we were raised in dominant culture in the United States, to engage skillful view, because it runs counter to what we were trained in. So that sounds, so to walk around being like, I'm the web, you're the web, and we're all the web, like that just sounds abstract and maybe nice to some of you and maybe silly to some of you, but I would just say, it actually has practical applications. So in a very real way, if we're moving through our day and we are cut off by someone, right? Like maybe we're in a line at the grocery store because now this happens, and someone like comes in and just goes right in front of us, for example. We can abide in a feeling of, and it's very normal when someone affronts us to feel, to fall into a smaller self and be defended. Hey, that's not You're not being a good neighbor. And I'm here and you should see me. And if in those moments where there's conflict, we can open to, okay, I'm a set of conditions. I'm a whole myriad thriving set of conditions. That person's a set of conditions. It's most likely that there's something going on for them that's causing them strain and stress. And it's likely that, and whether it's, their whole life or just in a moment, there's stuff happening for them that's making them not relate to us in the way that we're used to, which if we look at most of our human interactions, they're mostly connecting, usually. So we notice the people who are like not connecting and not attending to our relationship. If we can hold in that moment, instead of like, you've wronged me, but we could hold, that person is probably negotiating some suffering and I don't like what they've done to me. We don't have to let that go. There's a chance of something more skillful, both for ourselves and for whatever happens between us next to happen. We can, like, when in our forms and in our monastic forms and in Zen, like, we actually are training in relationality so that we may skillfully meet moments like this. Like, I was thinking how many people at Stone Creek, whether you've done monastic training or not, many people have done sesshin, or a one-day sitting, where we've done oryoki, the formal meal ceremony. Oryoki is a practice engagement of relationship. It's an actual expression of how we are all together, and it's actually an expression of right view. We feed one another, and we are fed by one another, and we trade that. It's like a cycle of relationship. And it actually trains us in relationality, so much so that we may, in another moment when someone's being rude to us, open to that connection that is there, and open to the myriadness of what they are versus being separated. Even though it might just seem like an efficient way to have lunch for 20 people. So these forms, so Zen, like these disciplines, oryoki is a discipline. We do have to train in it. It can cause anxiety. It shouldn't, because the point, that's the part of the point, I think, if oryoki is held, if it's held as an abstract thing where like the form itself, because it can be beautiful. So you could get into it like almost like choreography. But if it's held apart from its relational teaching, it can get really tight. And that's where people can feel like, oh, I got it wrong. Oh, sorry. But if we understand from the basis, it's a teaching about how we're connected, then anything that happens, including if your bowl falls on the floor and spills everything all over the place and it's a big mess and everyone has to stop, that's included. That's part of the relational field. We're okay. We're totally okay. When we lived at Tassajara, actually, I think I've mentioned this before, it's horrible. If you drop a utensil, everybody has to stop. And the person who's in charge of the meal has to walk all the way over to you, pick up your thing, bring it to the altar, incense it, and if you are trained, as I was at least partially, in shame as a form of social interaction, it can feel like, oh, I think this is shaming. It's totally not shaming. The root of it is, this is a whole ceremony, and we take care of every piece of it, even down to your utensil. And if that utensil falls on the floor, then we want to purify it. And we bring it back. And it's okay, actually, for everyone to stop and allow that piece to get put back in place so that we can all go forward together in alignment. And though the experience of being the utensil dropper brings up a lot of self, brings up a lot of conditioning. And you have to work hard to have it not fall into shame. Especially for someone like me, where that was the training of how we shaped one another's behavior, So I see a lot of these threads in what's happening with COVID and this pandemic. And well, first of all, I think it's almost like paradoxical, because on the one hand, we really do, I think, need to keep reminding ourselves, this is very hard. This is very hard on human beings. It is hard for us to be separated in these ways. It's hard to have these limitations. It's harming us, actually, in different ways from our social, from the parts of our brain and our bodies that thrive in social connection down to like to our gut functioning and our feeling of vitality and fatigue. And that isolation is real, and increasing depression and OCD and feelings of just loneliness are real, and we need to care for ourselves in that field. But I think the paradox of it is that at the same time, what we're doing essentially is trying to care for the whole. We can certainly argue that we may have collectively done this better. I'm fine with saying that, and that other countries have managed it with more care, actually, and that has been meant that there's less impact. But here we are, and things are getting worse in terms of numbers. And I heard something that's really impacted me, which was a person who was one of the founders of the thing called the COVID tracker, was saying, there's a way we can do these machinations of like, well, it's younger people getting it and try to make ourselves feel better about the rising numbers in some ways. But he said, essentially, you take the number of cases and 2% of those people are going to die. And like, so just very fundamentally, like the more cases, the more death. And for me, it's been an encouragement to me when I feel like I'm tired of it and I don't want to do it anymore. And I'd like to fudge it a little. And I'd really like to get on a plane and go anywhere. I remember that. And I think about human beings and human lives. And I feel, and we can feel it. Maybe it's abstract if we don't have people that are dying from this in our life. And that's where the discipline piece comes in, where we like pull in the discipline from our training in Zen to remember, like, even if I can't see it, I know it's true. I know my behavior impacts everybody. I know. And I care about that. And even if the people in my life are all okay, I care about the people in the spheres beyond that where I can see. And I do. I was running this by Charlie because I run by the things that I'm not sure if it's, is this a little too controversial? but for me, and so I checked out, could I mention something about vaccinations? So I'm a parent of an older, but also younger children. And in the world of parenting, vaccination comes up, especially in the world of West County parenting. Questions of vaccinations come up, and there's a lot of different feelings, and people get very worked up about this. I can just say for myself, my kids are vaccinated because I care about people beyond my sphere of seeing, because I have a sense that like what I do in this bubble of privilege and entitlement in which I live, and of healthcare and of access to healthcare and of good food and generally speaking good air and education, and what happens in that sphere that I'm in with me and my children has an impact, and it can have very negative impacts on people who live in environments nearby that don't have all those accesses. And that's why my kids are vaccinated. For me, it's not like a philosophical thing. It's sort of a scientific thing, but it's also in my heart, it's a religious thing, like it's a dharmic thing. We care for one another in this way. And I acknowledge, not every body can tolerate a vaccination, and that's certainly true. It's just like in the monastery, people get sick and they step out of the schedule. They step out of their role or their job, or a family member dies and they leave the practice period altogether. There's room for that, So there's room for that. Some people can't tolerate this, but we to engage that skillful view. And again, it's hard. It's hard for people like me who have been trained that like, well, whatever I do is just about me. It's about my choices. As I've been thinking about discipline and how it relates to freedom, I've been thinking about the expression freedom of choice. You have the freedom to choose. And again, in my training and experience, that's been elevated. Like freedom equals choice. And then that whole equation gets put in a container of individualism. So as long as I have my individual choices, I have my freedom. And I would say through our practice and as a discipline in our practice, we can wonder about that, because we can look and the more we study ourselves, the more we see we are not isolated beings. I am not separate from you and from everyone else. Last week in the Q&A, I think it was an exchange between Mary Kunav and Corinne. This idea about, what is full expression of ourselves? And again, in my training in the United States, a full expression of a person, or full freedom of a person, would mean I can do whatever I want. Like when I was a kid, I used to think like, when I grow up, I could eat whatever I want for breakfast, and I can get as many pets as I want. I'm going to do whatever I want all the time, But that's because, when you're a kid, you're not aware of your responsibilities really to others. When I'm an adult, I don't eat healthfully. Or maybe I should flip it around and say, I take care of myself and I eat healthfully. I don't have cookies for breakfast every day because I am relationship, full. I don't, and I think Mary brought up the example, like, you don't come running down the hallway screaming out every time you have a thought. Right. Because what we are is not, I sometimes do, which has an impact on the environment around me. But, what we are is not individual. I care about my family members and how my behavior impacts them, especially as an adult, right? Especially because I have a little bit of impulse control. So for me to fully express myself, the most skillful expression of myself is I walk into the room, I assess, where's everybody at? What are people doing? Are they up for hearing an interesting thought? I ask sometimes, are you up for hearing an interesting thought? I wait to hear the answer. These are my most skillful moments. Then I share maybe. But that is my full expression. I think we could see that kind of checking with ourselves and what looks like a limitation as if we only view ourselves as individual, that would look like a constraining or restricting. But I think we need to see it the other way around, that checking and that attending to one another is actually the full expression of ourselves, because we are relationship. We're made up of that. We care about how we impact one another. And I think, I know this is why that image of Indra's net becomes the basis for the class on the Dharma of Anti-Racism, because it's our commitment as living dharmic human beings to know that whatever I do impacts everybody, and that actually to live with that consciousness is not a restriction. It's freedom. To live that way is freedom. That there's the freedom to be fully relational and care about how whatever I do definitely impacts everybody, and everything everyone else does definitely impacts me. So this is our challenge, actually, as living beings, as selves that sometimes want to be disconnected, and many of us as selves that have trained to be disconnected and dissociated from one another. Our effort in Dharma is to wake up, as the Buddha did, to the web of connections, and then how do we take care of them, and how do we find our full expression as particular beings in caring for all of these webs of connection that we have. Thank you very much. The links, okay. So we can put in the chat. I just did want to put in the chat a couple of the links. One is this interview with this woman, Miriam Kaba, who's an abolitionist and activist and organizer. It's from a podcast called Beyond Prisons about reforming the what she calls a criminal punishment system. But I really recommend it. It's extremely dharmic, and she's not Buddhist, and but I do recommend listening to it as almost like a Dharma talk, and her perspective is very skillful view rooted. And then the other one was this species moment from that podcast, On Being, which is just a kind of encouragement. They were just touching on this idea of evolutionary anthropology, but there's more to explore there from there if it's interesting to you. But this idea that we're understanding ourselves to be interconnected in a way that Buddhism has rooted itself in for thousands of years, that now science is backing that up. So please, any thoughts or comments or questions? Let's scroll over here. So it was interesting to have, I was so happy to have the grid of all of you, but it probably looked weird, like I'm looking around at the squares instead of looking right at that camera.
I've got a question for you, or a comment. What I've been struggling with lately, which is it's painful, but it's also very relieving in some ways, is recognizing the fact that the people that I'm interconnecting with, if they do something that I find unacceptable to me, that it's not me. That's not something I necessarily did. That's what's going on inside their head in relationship to people around them. And then that comes out as maybe a breaking away for a moment, or doing something that I find, not beneficial to our friendship or connection. Mm-hmm. And that's a struggle. But if I can do it, it's very liberating.
Yeah, thank you. That could apply to so many things, but I don't know how it is for you, Steve. But to me, I'm seeing it a lot in myself and others around how people are responding to the rules around the pandemic, right? There's like this huge variety of interpretations. and it's really, and I think one of the things that happens for us as human beings is like we here's something we need to respond to. We figure out how we're going to do that. And then we pull forth our values and we figure out our thing, and then we watch how other people do it, and it either is aligned with us or not. And it's really hard not to get moralistic about that, and like you're saying, and this is the slippery slope where when people are causing harm, or when their boundaries are out of whack, we do need to say, I'm uncomfortable with this, or I need to talk to you, this isn't quite right. And also, we need to find our way into doing that in an open-hearted way, where we know most people are trying their best, and we're all dealing with different stressors and different things that are pulling on us, and different levels of support, actually, to take care of ourselves and one another. And then we just appreciate the ways we're supported to do it, versus dissing other people for how they're doing it wrong, or something like that. Does that ring true for you? Yeah. And I can say in the world of parenting right now, it's constant. It's constant because, people are wanting to get their kids together, but in these safe ways, and everybody's doing something different. And it's kind of maddening, actually. And it's for me, it's a definite discipline to keep coming back into, like, not going into blaming and judging, and just being like, okay, well, here's what I can deal with. Here's the choices I'm making. And if people are making different choices, it's, anyway, we have to find a skillful way to care for all of that, but shaming and judging is not going to be caring for it. And I think but it's I can see that how that training comes through for many of us, you know. Yeah, and there's freedom of being like, okay, I put it down.
Dōjin?
Yes.
It's Holly.
Hi, Holly.
Yeah, up at the top. I wanted to,
I
yeah.
have you front and center, actually. All right, I can't
Oh,
hear you.
good.
Okay.
We're at the top. I thank you for the talk. It was really thought-provoking, and the idea of relationship. And COVID has really caused a lot of stresses as far as cutting us off from our relationships and what we're used to as connecting with people. But I want to say also, I think it's also been a real opportunity because, well, it's interesting. I always write a Christmas letter. I mean, it's gone back to the 70s, and we've collected them, and it's a family history. But this year I sat down to write it, and at first I was just going to send a postcard and say, what is there to say? We all know, what happened and everything is terrible. But then I ended up writing one where I ended up listing all the things I was grateful for, the things that have come to pass during COVID, and why I was grateful or thankful for them. And I mean, there were some superficial ones, like I'm really thankful for Amazon, and I'm thankful for Zoom and things like that. But for instance, we have neighbors that we were never close to beforehand, and now they're really our social bubble, and we just love them so much. And that wouldn't have come around without that. And just talking about the doctors and the caregivers and everything, and the gratitude you have for them putting their lives out there. It's been a real experience to realize those things that normally I wouldn't have thought about.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Right. The many, many paradoxes of this time, There's some very, there's some sweet things to slow down, to stay put, even when it's uncomfortable. We can all probably see that there's some benefit to being like, oh, I can't chase around my ideas and my imaginings, into vacations and into buying stuff and into, all that drawing in. It's that same thing. It's again, that what the benefit in a monastic practice of drawing in and having limits. I think in astrology, it's like, for those of you who like astrology, which I do, it's like the archetype of Saturn, it's like the archetype of how limits allow for growth and maturation. And that's literally what monasteries are for. And it could be, if we practice hard, we do have to practice hard for this time to not just be like defeating, And I'm sorry that I didn't get back around to it, but that idea that hope is a discipline. It's beautiful the way she describes it. Like, hope is not a feeling. It's not optimism. It's not an aspirational, like just wistful thing. It's an engagement. If we want to be hopeful in this world, we need to create hopefulness. And we also need to depend on the capacity for all of us to change in a positive direction. Like, we have to really believe in that. We can't fall into despair and think like, well, it's all just gone to poop. We have to actually, to be engaged in the discipline of hope, we have to be creating positive change. And how that agency actually is really helpful for us. And then also meet our despair with great compassion and tenderness, because it's very, very challenging. And it does arise. Are there any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, Liz.
I'd like you to speak more to, the idea of relational. And it's always struck me that it's almost like I view Zen the Zen kind of decision making is non-relational, very non-collaborative. I can see where, in silence and in, taking on responsibilities and tasks yourself, that then you see yourself arising in, just like the example of Oryoki, where you have this form, then it enables you to see yourself come forward. And I see that in other things that we do. But like when just speak to this idea, I really don't see decision making as being collaborative, of being, like widespread. I see things being more, kind of like take on something and I'm thinking of early, like Zen Fest from early days.
Yeah.
It's like, it seems almost like a culture to me, like a Zen, a specific, and like being at Tassajara as a work guest one time, I was still washing the dishes on the commercial washer. No one noticed I wasn't at dinner, until finally someone realized if she doesn't finish washing the tea dishes, we won't be able to wash the dinner dishes. But it's, I mean, it's kind of this thing like, it seems to me almost a culture of by being on your own, you're going to, I think you see more about yourself, but I don't necessarily see this relational piece coming forward as, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. And there's like the solitude aspect of Zen practice, right? And like I think some of what you're describing, my best guess is that actually what you're describing is the way that Zen practice has been interpreted by dominant white culture, and that, so even like the early days of Zen Fest, and also the way we work in dominant culture, and the way that we also are overwhelmed all the time in dominant culture, so that it's not so much, I don't know how to say it. I don't think it's elementally Zen. Not that anything is actually, and Zen, it expresses itself in the different cultures where it is, and there's always that flavoring from the cultures where it is. But I would say though it's really something to look at and decision making, and I think so. This is something I think about a lot too, is the way the hierarchy of the tradition that came from Japan, at least in the case of Soto Zen, that valuation and strictness actually of hierarchy, because that, no doubt, that's a big part of Zen. The way that dovetailed with domination in the way that it functions in Western culture is ugly, actually, or it's actually, and it's counterproductive to really experiencing the teachings, that are there for what happens when we live and practice in concert with one another, and the concept of Sangha. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that and then so that solitude, as the way that it manifests in Zen practice, is actually overlaid with a Western idea of that, which is deeply entrenched in individualism. And so then you get like what feels like an isolated bunch of people in proximity to each other. But I think that's very particularly United Statesian, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been a strong current in a lot of convert Zen sanghas. And so that hierarchical domination thing has actually typified the functioning of a lot of institutions. And it's getting worked with now, because it's actually like, wait a second, is that what we want to keep doing? And is that liberating? And is it skillful? Is it skillful to have a bunch of individuated people trying to do something in concert where, it doesn't really work? And what do we have to do to get to a place of relationship is work with the conditioning we have around being separate, which is really deep conditioning. I don't know if that's too abstract.
No, it's helpful. I'd love to explore it more, as a group.
Yeah. Thank you, Liz. Mark, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to make a comment. I've been reading a bit about Taiwan, and when you're talking about the Oryoki discipline today and how I was so nervous when it was happening with me, but the essentially the individualism has been completely buried there, which is just amazing, and it really reminds me of the Oryoki kind of concept of what Taiwan has done with respect to COVID-19 and how they have just, the discipline there is just amazing, and everyone is, they're acting as a group to the extent of, like you talk about dropping your, an instrument. There was a story about a young boy who had to wear a pink mask to school. And he was very upset about it because no one had pink masks. And the two ministers, the minister and the assistant minister, got on TV and put on pink masks. and then the next day when he went to school, everyone wanted a pink mask. So there's this whole thing going on there because of what happened with SARS. And it's simple and it's also very detailed, like our Zen practice. That's just a comment. Thank you.
Yeah. A pandemic is a request to notice our relationships, like deeply. And I think and it's an opportunity to notice, like, what's the fabric of our relationships in a community and in a country. And there's so much to see there, Right. It's like you were saying, Taiwan had that experience of another pandemic. They actually have learned. There's the wisdom of what's already come, and there's other acculturating things, and there's other dominant cultures there, And still, I think that there's a lot in our practice that can help, that can support us to open to what wisdom teachings there are in this really difficult situation. I hope so, anyway. And that's certainly my intention with giving a talk. And if it's not, and truly, if there are things that are said in the talk that are not supportive, I really, really encourage you to reach out to me and let's look at it together. Okay. I'm just looking around. Anything else? Okay. Can you put the closing? Yeah. Okay. So we'll do the closing chant together. For great Bodhisattva beings are
Blessed.
I
vow to free them.
Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I